If you lived in Ontario in the 1800s, dying in the winter was not a great idea. It might be months before your body was buried, and certain things could go wrong during that time. Buildings like the one behind me were one way of dealing with those issues, and here in southern Ontario, there's about a dozen that took on a unique shape, an octagon. More than a century later, there's some theories, but we don't know exactly why. Welcome to the mystery of Ontario's octagonal dead houses. In the last video, we looked at Ontario's octagon homes and the legacy they've left. I recommend you watch that video before this one, and there's a link in the description. Burials were a lot different in 1800s Canada. Graves were all hand dug, so they could only really be made between the spring and the fall.
Hi, I'm Robin Lacey. I am a PhD candidate in the archaeology department at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. And I also run a research blog called Spade in the Grave, where I talk about my research in death and dying in archaeology. For the settlers in sort of the 17th through 19th centuries, they didn't have a lot of infrastructure to deal with dead bodies in the winter. We see problems with where to put them if the ground was too frozen. And there was also a lot of misconceptions in the time about where disease came from. They thought that the smell that came from a decaying body or decaying animals even was something that could make you sick, which is not true unless it's a very infectious disease like Ebola, which was not something they were dealing with at the time.
So yes, bodies don't tend to be major sources of disease unless you eat them. But that wasn't the only risk. Although it was rare around here, there was a chance that in the spring, the bodies wouldn't be there.
Body snatching was really a problem in the UK, but we did see a bit of it in North America. There are recorded accounts sort of in New York and in Montreal, especially places that had medical schools, stealing bodies for the anatomists. So there are a chance that the dead houses that we see in Canada, especially maybe the ones around Toronto and Montreal, may have been used just to protect the dead bodies. But I think for the most part, dead houses were used in Canada more as a winter burial practice.
So how could graveyards keep bodies cold and secure during the winter months? The answer was often a building like this in Queensville Cemetery. They have several names, but they're often called winter vaults, receiving tombs, or dead houses. Dead houses were fairly common in the northern states and in Canada, where the climate was cold enough. They were usually simple buildings made of brick or stone to keep them sturdy and secure, and they usually had a square or rectangular floor plan. However, between 1855 and 1914, something unique happened in southern Ontario.
So around the Toronto area and southwestern Ontario, we see this really interesting trend of octagonal dead houses. They are mostly made of brick, some of them aren't, but they all sort of are in that southwestern Ontario region.
There's about 10 known octagon dead houses in this part of southern Ontario. This is the one in Aurora Cemetery just north of Toronto. It dates back to 1868. This one is in Richmond Hill, and this is the one, as we saw, in Queensville. It says it was built in 1886, and author John Rempel, who is the author from the previous video, said it cost around $400 to build. That would be more than $10,000 in 2023 money. Octagon dead houses seem most common between Lake Ontario and Lake Simcoe. Besides one comment I saw on Robin's site, they don't seem to exist anywhere else in North America. If you do know of any others, please let me know in the comments and we'll get them added to Robin's database. These were certainly unique and they're still beautiful in the present day. But why build dead houses as octagons in the first place? At the time I'm making this video, we still don't have a definitive answer to that question, but there are some interesting theories.
One is that it was just an architectural trend that people were really interested in having. The earliest octagonal dead house we have is in Toronto from the 1850s, and it was this beautiful sort of, had elements of Gothic revival architecture seen in the brickwork, and there was theories that this space may have been better for the storage of dead bodies, but that doesn't really make much sense. It'd be really weird if an octagonal building was the optimal space to sort of stack coffins in the winter, and usually they did have free-floating shelves inside of them that were rectangles. So the structure was definitely more visual than it was practical. But there's also the theory that the number 8 in Christianity was very significant. The eighth day was the resurrection, and we see the number 8 being used quite a lot in Christian architecture. There is also the theory that that number was being translated in with the resurrection to this space that was used to hold dead bodies.
The significance of the number 8 is even older in Judaism. The story of Noah's Ark says 8 family members were saved from the Great Flood, and the rite of circumcision takes place on the 8th day. But these cemeteries that have octagonal dead houses, they're not all part of the same faith. Really, any of the reasons Robin listed could be plausible. As of right now, we still don't have a definitive answer as to why some dead houses took this shape, but there is one more possibility.
My name is Stephen Heaton. I've always been interested in architecture, and I am president of the Willowbank Cemetery. And our dead house was built in 1885. And my guess is that he was probably inspired by the mid-Victorian farmhouse. And our little winter vault is actually a replica of that kind of a house. But I really have never heard of anybody suggesting that the designer of our dead house was particularly sophisticated or particularly inspired by anything more than his own whim. And seeing these kind of houses, which are incredibly common. So I'm a great believer that sometimes the simplest explanation actually trumps the more sophisticated one, but you really never can be quite sure.
This whole phenomenon of Ontario's octagon dead houses could trace back to one or a few builders. Maybe somebody saw the building, liked how it looked, and simply copied the design without knowing the original creator's intentions. Maybe somebody watching this video knows about how Ontario's first few octagon dead houses came to be. If that's you, please leave a comment and help us close this knowledge gap. By the 2020s, a lot of the old winter vaults have simply disappeared from the landscape. With modern machinery and ground warming tools, burials can happen year-round, and that's made buildings like these obsolete. There are still some places that use dead houses, but these are certainly the exception rather than the norm. In most places, there's few reminders of how important these buildings once were, and that might be a missed opportunity.
Today, mostly we see these dead houses as sort of a relic of how we used to deal with death care. Because they're located in a cemetery, you probably would have had the whole funeral procession and then sort of ritually buried them within this dead house until the grave could actually be dug in the spring. So it was more of a symbolic space in the community for burial until it could happen. But today they're sort of not really known about quite as much. They're seen as an interesting architectural feature of these cemeteries, but we see them being reused as storage sheds on properties. It would be really interesting to see these properties being reused and sort of interpreted to the public as what they used to be, and maybe opened up occasionally and be like part of a heritage tour for their architecture as well as their place in death care historically.
These buildings can represent the challenges that people faced generations ago and how they solved those problems in ways that went beyond basic function.
I think that they've survived because they are so curious. Architecturally, they're such like an interesting design in a space that you don't normally associate with interesting architecture, which is a cemetery. And a lot of them have locally made bricks and these really interesting details. And so the people that were building them were definitely putting a lot of care into this space they were creating.
Octagon dead houses have some connections with octagon homes. They were both built around the same era, and they both promised to bring major benefits. Octagon homes were supposed to improve the lives of the people within them, and octagon dead houses gave loved ones a more dignified resting place before they could be buried. Both served their purpose in time, but there is one major difference. Octagon homes could still theoretically make a comeback, but their dead house cousins are already in their final resting place, serving today as part of Canada's living history.